Americans loved Ali more the less he was able to talk. If Malcolm X were alive today, talking the same way he was the day of his martyrdom, he'd be called a sexist or male chauvinist. He'd be called a homophobe, and all of these things, because he spoke about traditional gender roles, and he talked about also, and he was a family man. He also talked about heterosexual morality, right? So he'd probably be canceled by many of these woke groups today.
No, I'm not worried at all. I rely on God, Allah.
On behalf of the Lifehawk team, thank you for watching this video. And for more clips and beneficial content, please subscribe to the Lifehawk channel, your #1 source for personal Islamic development.
Really appreciated this past week your lecture in United Islam Awareness Week on Malcolm X, because how wise of a man, how forward thinking he was at his time, that the statements that he made and some of the statements you were sharing that he made during his time, in the 50s and early 60s, that they're just as relevant today. You know what I mean? And they're just as relevant in how we deal with things today. And if we can, maybe discuss some of these, some of his accomplishments or some of the things that he said. But one thing that you mentioned was his criticism of the black bourgeoisie,
Yes.
Right? So they feel like, and some of them would ally themselves with white people, and it would maybe on the surface seem like they're doing something for their communities, but they really in essence aren't really changing something, or they're not really benefiting their communities. And we see, I think, some similar signs of that and elements of that today with the Muslim community. Would you like to comment on that, if you see that as well?
Yeah. So one of the critiques that Malcolm X made, of course, was about the black bourgeoisie. And as I mentioned Friday night, as much as Malcolm critiqued outside and critiqued white supremacists and their systems that they set up, both racism in America as well as neocolonialism and imperialism abroad, he also was very critical about black people, about how we operate, about accepting the immorality of the broader culture. And he also critiqued the black bourgeoisie. And this has always been a tension within Black America. As I mentioned, Malcolm X's father was a very strict Christian who was a follower of the Pan-Africanist Marcus Garvey. And at that time, there was a rivalry between Marcus Garvey, who represent the grassroots of Black people in America and in the Caribbean. And then you had W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the first African-American to get a PhD from Harvard University, who came up with this idea called the talented tenth, that basically it was a Black bourgeoisie. It was the 10% of the population of Black people who he saw were the Black elite that would then set the agenda and supposedly lift up 90% of Black people who are normally darker in skin color and not of the elite class, right? And W.B. Du Bois later left and abandoned that ideology, and he made hijra into Ghana and died in Ghana. But it's to say that the same type of element in which Malcolm X's father as a Christian critiqued Malcolm X as a Muslim, and I mean as a Sunni Muslim, not just part of the proto-Islamic movement, Nation of Islam. He critiqued the Black bourgeoisie. And on the one end, their cozying up so much to the white liberal establishment. And today we would call it the progressive woke establishment, that it literally undermines the foundation of the community, doing for self, and again encourages Black people to copy almost slavishly the immorality and the lack of societal ethics that is propagated by the dominant liberal culture.
And one could we say that a supremacist culture really cannot sustain itself without establishing an elite class to collaborate with, like an elite class from the culture that they're dominating. So
Yeah.
they basically keep their own people in check. Because if we look at it worldwide, whether it's dictators, whether it's Islamophobes, like the ones that are really active, like Ayaan Hirsi Ali, like they're basically doing the dirty work for this supremacist culture, you know what I mean, or these sort of supremacist forces, you know what I mean.
Yeah, it's an old playbook. I mean, we know that the British did it in the Indian subcontinent, and they would favor certain people who were Uncle Tom Daisies. And then, of course, we had the Qadiani movement that was supported by those people. So you have the Daisy Uncle Toms. And then you also have the same issue that took place in the United States of America, and then you have the proverbial house Negro that would get some special privileges, and then he would rat out and turn in the masses of Black people because maybe he got a little bit better clothes and a little bit better food. And Malcolm X talked about this in great detail. So this is an old playbook of divide and conquer, where the supremacists, and I'll even go further and say that those who are adversarial towards Islamic morality and Islamic ethics, they'll take a group of people. They could be South Asian, they could be Arab, they could be African, and give them a little token position, give them a little trinkets, maybe even give them a book deal, let them lead a big march somewhere, right? And fund them, but then that person's used to pacify and undermine the grassroots and the masses of people who are committed to the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It's the old trick, and unfortunately, Muslims we're poor students of history, because if we read history, then we could clearly see what's going on right now. And I'll end with this point before you continue. Malcolm X, rahimahullah ta'ala, said, "Of all of our studies, history is best qualified to reward our research." Of all of our studies, history is best qualified to reward our research. So if we want to see what's going on wrong right now and try to avert it in the future, if we just take a look back in the past and study the past, we'll see the same old playbook, right?
How do you think Malcolm X resisted being part of this elite bourgeoisie class? Because there was offers made to him, whether it's through the FBI institutions or being funded by white liberals and so forth. How do you think he resisted that temptation? Because it's tempting. Like, you want to put food on the table for your family, you want to provide house, like you want some comforts of life. How did he resist that? Because that's very tempting for a lot of people, whether it's du'at, speakers today, Muslim leaders.
Well, two things. One, it relates to the upbringing of his father and his mother, who struggled a lot, and they took principled stances. And he saw it even though he was very young, and then he learned about it. And even though he went wayward as a teen, that seed was planted in him. So he knew that his father stood up to the Klan. He knew the strength of his mother standing up to the establishment. They both were leaders in the United Negro Improvement Association, UNIA. That's number one. Number two, simply put, Malcolm was a man of yaqeen. He had conviction. When he believed in something, he believed in it to the hilt, and he was willing to give his life for it. And many people don't attribute this quote to him, but he is the rightful person of attribution. But Malcolm X is the one who said that if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. He's the one that said that. So, but it takes yaqeen to hold that position. And of course, the day of Malcolm's martyrdom, he was facing, his family was facing eviction, and yet, even after their family's home was firebombed, they were living in someone else's home. He had no money, right? So, but so Malcolm walked the path of Iman and Yaqeen, but he basically was penniless, but for him, it was about seeking the wedge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
That now that you say that, I think probably one of the things that really set him apart from even compared to other black leaders at his time, was his level of sincerity. The FBI was doing surveillance on him. NYPD was doing surveillance on him. And there's a statement, there's a tweet that was sent out by his daughter, Ilyasa Shabazz. She said, she showed a picture of Malcolm X in Cairo. He says, my father in Cairo weeks before he'd be assassinated at age 39. Despite following his every move, an FBI informant called him a man of high moral character who neither smokes nor drinks. She goes on to say he spoke truth to power, and we know that truth is timeless. As opposed, but say if you compare it to, say, Martin Luther King Jr., through the surveillance, documentations, this is how they found out about his affair and things like that. So he really set himself apart by being sincere. Like what he was in public, that's who he was in private. Would you say that's probably his also one of his greatest defining characteristics?
Yes, no doubt about it that Malcolm was sincere, and that set him aside from others. I said last month during a talk, and I put a lot of thought into it, but the man, Malcolm, rahimahullah ta'ala, the Sahabi that I think of most when I think of Malcolm X is I think of Salman al-Farisi. And the reason why I say Salman al-Farisi and we're talking about sincerity is because Salman was born into a Zoroastrian family. And then when he came across something that he thought was better, which is Christianity, he left Majusi religion for Christianity. And then when he heard about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then he came across the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he then sincerely left Christianity and became Muslim. Likewise, Malcolm grew up in a Christian household. And then when he came across something that he found to be better, he joined that, which was the Nation of Islam. And just like Salman leaving Christianity, Malcolm left the nation. And when he came across the pure teachings of the Quran and the Sunnah, then he embraced that. So that's a sign of sincerity that you can say, look, I was following this and I found something that is truer, that is better. I found the Haqq, in admitting that, you know what, I was wrong on some things and now I'm striving to follow the right path. That is sincerity. And how many people can do that, to say we followed something or were raised in something, and then we will realize that it was batil and will leave the way of our forefathers to follow the Haqq. Not many people have sincerity to do that, but Malcolm did.
That's true, and you make a very powerful point that if a person is truly sincere, they're willing to change if they can admit they're wrong or if they haven't fully found the truth yet. And you make because he's often portrayed as being somebody who was very rigid and strict, but actually he was very flexible. Like when he found the truth, he changed. And similar to like the Sahaba, the mentality of the Sahaba, when an ayat is coming to them, this is the truth, they have like maybe a habit for years that they're engaged in. They're willing to change in a short period of time. And that can only be done if a person has a sincere heart. So that's actually a very important point, like, because as you mentioned, we need to reclaim that history, the portrayal of Malcolm X. You can't just let Spike Lee do it. You can't just let these activist groups, portray him how they want to portray him. Especially since, to tell you the truth, Sheikh, I feel that a lot of these groups that virtue signal through Malcolm X, at his time, they probably wouldn't have supported him. You know what I mean? It's nice to retroactively do this virtue signaling of historical figures, but we got to remember, like, even Muhammad Ali, half of America was against him. They thought he was a pariah. Most of the people, despised Malcolm X. Especially amongst white people. But now it's easy to go back in time and say, oh yeah, he stood up for something, and FBI reports say he was sincere. It's easy to accept somebody like that afterwards.
That's right. And
Yeah.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a despised man when he was murdered, including the black bourgeoisie condemned Dr. King in a New York Times op-ed. The head of the National Urban League and the head of the NAACP wrote a joint op-ed condemning King because he dared question the racist policies of the American government operating in Vietnam. And so they brought out the black bourgeoisie to condemn Dr. King. Even Muhammad Ali, who was a beloved figure in America when he died a few years ago, I think 3 years ago or so. Americans loved Ali more the less he was able to talk.
Yeah.
Right. When Muhammad Ali was starting to lose his physical functioning and his speech, and he went to Iraq and negotiated with Saddam Hussein back in 1990 or 91 to get some people free who were working for General Motors in Iraq. That was not a popular move. He was mocked in the New York Times, right? So it's like these leaders, and this same thing has happened to Malcolm X within the black bourgeoisie and even the woke crowd. They try to reform them and remake them into something that they weren't, and in order to try to appropriate them for their purposes. But you know that if Malcolm X were alive today, talking the same way he was the day of his martyrdom, he'd be called a sexist or male chauvinist. He'd be called a homophobe, and all of these things, because he spoke about traditional gender roles, and he talked about also, and he was a family man. He also talked about heterosexual morality, right? So he'd probably be canceled by many of these woke groups today.
One thing I want to know if you have any insight in regards to this, from a perspective to maybe get new or more inside information about his life. But obviously there's a big change when he went for Hajj. So that was a very big change in his ideas, in his and how he would probably continue in his work in activism and whatnot. And as you read the biography of Malcolm X, there's a few key figures that I think play a significant role in that change, which he also acknowledges. So he acknowledges the help that he got to go for Hajj by Sheikh Muhammad Yusuf Shuarbi, who at that time was, I think, assigned from Azhar to be almost like the Mufti of like U.S. or the representative of Islam in U.S. and Canada. Do we have any information what happened to this Sheikh? Like he basically needed to give him permission to be able to go for Hajj, and Malcolm X describes him as being like a very helpful man, and then he also gave him the contact for Dr. Muhammad Abdurrahman Azam, right? And then his son, Dr. Omar Azam, that he met afterwards. Do we know what happened to firstly the Sheikh, Dr. I think Mahmoud Yusuf Shuarbi?
Yes, I'm not totally sure, but I'm sure that there's still some people alive, or perhaps even Malcolm's family, his eldest daughters probably would have some knowledge about that. He also had a Murabbi that was with him in New York, Shaykh Ahmed Hassoun, and that's the Shaykh from Sudan who did his ghusl, and also was the one who was making dua. And there's like some footage and pictures of him. He's wearing, of course, Sudanese style, all white thobe with the white amama wrapped up as our Sudanese brothers beautifully wrap it. Then, of course, Malcolm was a guest at Azhar when he was abroad for 7 months. When he left for Hajj and then spent time in Cairo, he was a guest of Shaykh al-Azhar, Mahmoud Shaltut, rahimullah ta'ala. And then he had a special teacher that was guiding him at Azhar. I'm forgetting the name of the teacher off the top of my head. But there were, there were people along the way who were helping and assisting Malcolm X, besides Imam Warth Din Muhammad, rahimahullah ta'ala, who was the first to really introduce him, the first African American to ever introduce him to any sort of mainstream knowledge. And Imam Warth Din Muhammad got kicked out of the nation before Malcolm did, and he was one of Elijah Muhammad's sons. And actually, the nation was so radical at that time that there even were death threats against Elijah Muhammad's own son for him having the audacity to saying that Allah did not come in the person of a man to Detroit in the year 1930, right?
Because and then also those two figures, have you heard anything about them? The Muhammad Abdul Rahman Azam and Dr. Omar Azam, like when you read some of Malcolm X's own diary, and also I think it's reflected in the books by Alex Haley, like these two figures like really opened his eyes in terms of like breaking down the black nationalist ideology, because he's like, they gave him his house, they gave their own house to him and treated him like with such honor and dignity and respect, and like he's like, they were treating me like a celebrity. You know what I mean? The way that they uplifted this brother who's coming from, they didn't even know him. Oh, you got this Dr. Sheikh Shwarbi told you to look us up, and just the hospitality and the taking care of the guest, like it seems like it had like such a fundamental, profound effect on him. Yeah, go ahead.
It did. And I heard this story from another Sudanese brother I was on a panel on recently. If you were to go to CARE's Facebook page on February 26th, you can see it. He's a Sudanese brother also who was part of the MSA, who knew Malcolm for 4 years, even before he left the nation and afterwards, and was part of that Hajj group. And he was an eyewitness to that story, by the way. He probably would have some more information. But one thing I like to say, though, and you mentioned the term black nationalism, I like to bring in a little slightly different take on it, or use different wording. What those two did is they helped break down black supremacy from Malcolm. But as far as black nationalism, Malcolm continued to use that term until the time of his martyrdom. He just defined it differently than what we would define as al-Sabiyya. What he said, that like other communities, that black people in urban areas are marginalized, and that instead of having people outside of the black community who are aided and abetted by the government and banks who exploit the resources of the black community, that black people should control the economics and the culture within the black community, like in Harlem. And that's what he called black nationalism. So it wasn't black.
That's true.
But he always used the term black nationalism. He was very critical of Jewish Americans in particular, who were the business owners, as well as owned the slums, owned the tenements that had black people at the time living in most major cities, almost like in so-called third world conditions, while they were getting rich and lining their pockets off of our misery.
Yeah, no, that's true. I agree with you. He changed his perspective on black nationalism. That's I think that's an important like distinction to make for sure. But he did definitely mention even after Hajj about bringing together black unity, black empowerment, and so forth as a priority. So no, jazakallah khair for mentioning.
Do I feel that the New York police are providing enough protection, or do I have to have protection of my own? I look for protection from Allah.